All right, hello everyone and welcome to our webinar today. We are going to be talking about efficient file management in a fast-moving agile environment. Now, a big part of being efficient in an environment like this includes not only Flare to manage your source content, but additional tools that you can add to your tech stack, specifically source control platforms to help manage files, versions of those files, which can really be helpful in a fast-moving, continuous development environment. And I am so excited to have Paul Stoecklein back in the webinar seat joining us today. Paul heads up the documentation efforts here at MadCap Software. And today we're going to get an overview of how the MadCap doc team was able to pivot and support our own Agile development environment. And in addition, Paul's going to review some tips for minimizing problems and also ways to ensure content authors can stay in sync. So welcome, Paul. Always so fun to have you, and thanks for sharing your knowledge with us today. Now, before we begin, a couple items of business that I want to cover that we always like to do before we start these webinars. Just as a reminder, we will be recording this session. So if you have to leave early, not to worry, we'll send you a link to the recording as soon as it's done. There's also a Q&A area in the GoToWebinar console. So if you have questions as Paul's going through all this, please drop a question in. We have a lot to go through today, so we may not be able to get to everything, but whatever we don't get to live, we'll do our best to follow up as quickly as possible with a question and answer document for everyone. So again, Paul, I know you got a lot to cover, and I do hope everybody can hear us and can see our screens okay. But I do, Paul, want to turn it over to you and just welcome you once again.
Thanks very much, Jen. And hi, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your schedule to check out this webinar. So this webinar is about file management with source control. It's not because I love source control, but source control is really important. And like most people, I really need it. The problem is my relationship with source control hasn't always been great, like everybody else. When working with source control, I get conflicts, I get error messages that I can't figure out. The reason I wanted to do this webinar is really simple. A few years ago, I started using a particular system that's really helped me a lot, especially with MadCap moving to more of an agile release cycle where I needed to react quicker and have more flexibility because we started doing more frequent product releases. And I just wanted to tell other people about this system in case it helps somebody else like it's helped me. Now, a couple of other things I should say right up front. First, in this webinar, I talk mainly about concepts and processes, things like that. I'm not really going into specific steps on how to do this or how to do that. I'll touch on that very briefly and show you a little bit, but there's simply not time to do both the conceptual and the how-to. However, at the end of the webinar, I'm going to give you a link to an internal Madcap Pdf that I put together a few years ago that contains all of the how-to steps and more. So I'm trying to give you both the high level and the low level, but just not all of it in 1 hour. Second, this subject matter is something that can take some time to internalize, to wrap your brain around. There's a lot of information and it might not all sink in and make sense right away, but that's okay. You know, sometimes you got to watch a webinar more than once, or you got to go over something more than once before you really get it all. So the general idea of source control, it's really not that hard. You got your project files locally, and then there's a copy of those files up on a server. And as you work and make changes, you upload and download those changes. Now, I've always thought that everybody should be using source control. I think it's useful even for a solo writer, but it's especially important when you've got a team of writers working on the same files, because you got to keep everybody's files in sync. So source control, it's really important, but unfortunately, not all source control providers are created equal. Back in 2005, when we first started MadCap Software, we were using Microsoft Visual Source Safe, which was horrible. I'm convinced that SourceSafe was invented just to bring about my early death, and it almost succeeded. But fortunately for me, I didn't die, SourceSafe did. And a couple of years later, we moved to Microsoft Team Foundation Server, which is now called Azure DevOps Server. And that was much better than SourceSafe. And for the most part, I was pretty happy with it. Still, it had its limitations. Then in 2017, we moved to Git, and it's the best source control tool I've used since I started working as a tech writer. Now, Flare also integrates with tools like Perforce, Helix Core, and Subversion, but I've never used either of those, so I can't really comment on them. I've heard they're both really good, but I don't have any firsthand experience with them, and that's why I'm not going to talk about them in this webinar. So this webinar is mainly about Git, but one of the great things about Flare is you have all these options, and there are some principles that I talk about in this webinar that can be applied to these other tools. So what I'm going to tell you about in this webinar is my experience with Git over the past few years, but I'm also going to tell you about the Git Flow system that I learned about and adopted. And to me, this system of using Git is just as important as the tool itself. I think too many times we just tend to go, you kind of inherit whatever tools your company has, and you get your source control tool and you go, okay, well, here's the source control tool. Everybody just start uploading and downloading things and we'll see what happens, hope for the best. You can't really do that if you expect it to work well. You need a plan. You need a good plan with rules and guidelines. If you don't have that, you're more likely to end up with a mess. And I learned that the hard way. A lot of us do. I'm not going to cover how to set up Git itself on your own server. That's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar. Maybe you already have it set up in your company. Maybe you need to get your IT department involved to set it up on your own servers. It's different for each company. The thing is, you have options. If you don't want to set Git up on your own server, you can use one of the many repository solutions that are out there. Things like GitHub, GitLab, CloudForge, Bitbucket. You can use those. Okay, so let's look at this Git system that I'm talking about. But first, we need to understand some Git terminology, because even though all of these source control tools kind of do the same things, a lot of times they have their own unique terms. So first, the term repository. A repository, it's the collection of files that keeps track of all of your changes over time. And you have both local and remote repositories. So you've got a remote repository, which you see at the top in this graphic. Remember, you've got the copy of your project files up on the server where you've set it up, and it's all represented up by this square or rectangle that you see up here. And there's a repository that's associated with those Flare project files. That's your remote repository. But then each Flare author who is bound to that remote Git repository, they also have their own repository locally on their computer next to their Flare project files. So this graphic shows these two squares down here at the bottom, each one representing the Flare project files for two imaginary authors. And each author has a local Git repository for their Flare project files. And that's why when you're bound to Git, when you bind a project to Git, that's why you see a Git folder alongside your Flare project files in Windows. That's that is your local repository. So, and this is a really good system to have a local repository because it's always faster to work with files locally than it is remotely. So these local repositories are keeping track of what each writer is doing. Oh, this writer added some content to these files, and they added this new file, and they deleted those files, and so on. Next is the term pull. This just means a person is moving changes from the remote repository down to their local repository. It's part of keeping these repositories in sync. And then there is the idea of a commit. This is a command that is used to save changes to your local repository. And I really like this concept because it helps you keep your changes organized. So the way I usually work in Flare is I make a bunch of changes in my Flare project, and these changes are all related to each other in some way. And then I might pivot at some point in the day to make a bunch of other changes that are different from the first group of changes. For example, I might work on some what's new files, and I make a bunch of edits to those files, and then at some point I go, well, I think I'm done for the time being with changes to these what's new files. So I save all of those changes as one commit because they all have something in common. They had to do with the what's new documentation. And I put a comment on it so that I know what I was doing. I might just simply say in the comment something like made edits to what's new files, or you can get more detailed if you need to. Then maybe I do a whole bunch of other changes related to, say, some PDF outputs, and I save those changes as another commit. And I put a comment on that too. I might say something like you see here, adjusted page breaks and image sizes for PDFs. And the reason it's important to put comments on commits is that sometimes you might have to look in the history of what you've done and make certain decisions based on a particular commit. For example, you might want to back out certain changes, and that's easier to do if you organize your commits and comment on each one. So then there's a push, and this is the opposite of a pull, obviously. A push is where you move changes from your local repository up to the remote repository. And here's the order that you want to do things. First, you do a pull. And then after you do some work in your project, you save one or more commits with your changes to your local repository. And then you push those commits up to the remote repository. Now, if you do a push and some other writer has uploaded new changes at some point since your last pull, you'll get a message. And the message is telling you that basically it's telling you you need to do a pull because you're not up to date. So you do that, you do a pull to get their changes from the remote repository, and then you can go ahead and finish your push. But that's the basic order that you do things. And then there's the idea of a merge. Now, a merge is where you're moving commits from one branch to another branch. But of course, in order to understand that, you got to know what branching is about. And that's where we're going to spend a lot of the focus of the rest of this webinar. For me, branching is the secret sauce that's completely changed the way I do things from the way I did them before with Team Foundation Server. And it's made life much easier for me. It allows me to work better and more efficiently, especially in an agile environment where things are happening fast. So what is branching? Well, a branch is a unique collection of commits with its own name. This way, with multiple branches, you can keep different collections of change. So it allows you to have different variations of your Flare project for different purposes. It's not different copies of your Flare project. You just have one project. It's variations. It's saying, here's my Flare project with these changes, and then here's my Flare project with these other changes, and so on. So for example, I might be working in a certain branch of my Flare project, and I open a topic and I add a paragraph like you see here. Well, later I might switch to a different branch of my Flare project and I open that same topic, but I won't see the paragraph from that other branch. But then I might add all kinds of content to the second branch, like this image that you see here in the extra text below. And that's the only branch where I'll see that content. I'm in the same project. It's just that I'm seeing only changes that are specific to that branch. And then if I go back to the first branch, I'm only going to see that paragraph that I added earlier. So the branches aren't going to show the changes that are specific to the other branches. But then maybe I decide to merge one of these branches into the other branch. So after I do that, I can see the changes from both branches combined in the same topic. I can see that paragraph that I added in the first branch, and I can see the image in the extra text below from the second branch. So people use branches when they're trying to keep related changes separate from other changes. For example, people will often use branches when documenting different features, or it could be used, branches could be used for other purposes like doing file maintenance or hot fixes. Some people might be wondering, well, what's a hot fix? Well, that's when you have output that's already been published sometime in the past, but there's something you need to add, delete, or fix in that output. And so you just sort of want to patch that output in a way without messing up all the other new stuff that you're working on for a future release. And I'll talk a little bit more about hot fixes later. Here's an example of 3 branches for the same project. Let's say you need to document 2 different features for your company's product. So you could create a branch dedicated to the first feature. Maybe it's for a feature called the widget editor. So you name the branch widget editor just, to make it easy. And then you create another branch for documenting the second feature. Maybe that feature is called a font selector, and so you name the branch font selector. Makes sense. And then maybe you decide you want to reorganize some folders and topics and snippets in your project, rename them, move them around. So you can create a separate branch for that and maybe name the branch reorg files. By the way, this is just an illustration of branches. I've got in this illustration, you can see I've got spaces in the names, but I don't think you're allowed to have spaces between words. I use dashes between each word when I name my branches. So why would you do this? What's the point of having separate branches when you can just do everything in one place? Well, have you ever been documenting a bunch of stuff for a release, and then at some point the product manager comes along and goes, yeah, Paul, our developers said they just don't have time to finish features 8 through 10. They'll get features 1 through 7 done, but 8, 9, and 10, they're not going to happen for this release. And your heart sinks and you go, but I already made a whole bunch of changes all over the place for those features. And they go, well, you'll just have to back them out. And you go, how? And they say, I don't know. That's what you got to figure out. Go find the changes and can put conditions on them, condition them out. I don't know. You ever have something like that happen to you? Well, we used to release Flare once a year. And in some ways that was harder for me, and in some ways it was easier for me. I did have more time and more of a warning if certain features weren't going to make it into the release. But now we release Flare 2 or 3 times a year. Not only that, but we also have other products that we might be doing releases for throughout the year. And then we have our cloud platform, MadCap Central, where we're releasing a lot more frequently than our desktop products. So between all of these products, we have all kinds of features that are being developed at the same time. And I know a lot of people are working for companies where they're putting out releases more frequently than we are. They might be doing it weekly. So in addition to all that, I don't have things in different projects. I have all of the documentation for all of our products in one big Flare project. That's just the architecture that I decided works best for us. Instead of having separate projects for each product, your situation might be different, but for us, we have everything in one project. So when MadCap became more agile, I had to adjust how I did things to keep up with all the different features coming from all these different directions. And branching was the biggest change in how I work. For me, it's really important to be able to keep the documentation for each thing separate for a while until I know for sure if it's going to be a part of the release. So branching allows me to work on things anytime I want, to get a head start on some features and and then more easily be able to include only certain documentation in a final release on short notice. Now, the system that I use isn't something I came up with. Git Flow is the brainchild of a guy named Vincent Dreesen. And one of our developers at MadCap told me about it because our developers adopted this same methodology for their work. So I'm doing essentially the same thing our developers are doing. They're using this system for their files, and I'm using it for my documentation files. I just made a few custom tweaks to the system to fit me as a Flare author. And here is how that Git Flow system works for me. Okay, I'm creating the following types of branches, and there isn't any special mechanism to designate a particular branch as one of these types. It's really just a matter of deciding what kinds of branches you want for different purposes and naming them accordingly. And then following whatever rules and guidelines you establish for each branch type. First is the master branch. Now this branch is simply the current version of your documentation, the version that's already published and it's out there for your customers to see. So you don't mess with this branch often. It's just when you're publishing the next version of your documentation that it gets updated. Now the next branch is called release, and this is the next version of your documentation. It's what's coming next. It's the collection of all the stuff you're working on. For example, maybe you've got a product and it's currently on version 4 and you're working on documentation for version 5. So the master branch has the version 4 documentation and the release branch has the version 5 documentation. And the release branch is eventually going to be merged into your master branch and kind of take its place. So then the most recent changes in the master branch would be version 5 of the documentation, and then you start working on version 6, and the release branch will accumulate that documentation over time until you get to the end of that release cycle. Then I create several other branches, and these are all what I call feature branches. So for example, we've released several new features in Flare over the last few years. Micro content, that's one of the features. So I had a micro content feature branch as I worked on that documentation. Salesforce enhancements, that was another feature. So that was another feature branch. Code snippets, that was another feature. So I had another branch for that, and so on. These branches are where most of the work is actually done. Then it's just a matter of merging those changes into the release branch when the time is right. Now I have one more type of branch that I call develop, And this branch is really just kind of a staging area. It's a place where I can merge changes from all different kinds of branches, so I can see everything in one place as it's being developed. I use this branch for different purposes, like creating checklists in MadCap Central, but it's not meant to be integrated into the final output. So movement of changes always goes into this branch, but never out of this branch. It's almost a disposable branch. I actually delete it from time to time when it gets too messy, and then recreate it all over again. Now, remember that with Git, you have a local repository and a remote repository. So this particular graphic shows two different Flare authors who are working in the same branch. So each of those authors has a local version of that branch, and there's also a remote version of that branch. Let's say these authors are working on a feature branch. They're both documenting the same feature for an upcoming product release. Well, from time to time, each author needs to pull changes from the remote version of that branch in case there are changes in the branch from the other author. And periodically, each author needs to push their changes from the local branch up to the remote branch. So here's how it all looks in the Git Flow system. This graphic shows time going from the top and moving downwards. And I've got my master branch, which is just kind of sitting here. The dot stands for the most recent commit or merging of commits. It's a point in time with a specific set of changes. The dot represents the most recent version of our published output for a product. To use the example from before, this dot might represent the product's version 4 documentation. Next to that is my release branch. Now the release branch, of course, that's the next version of the documentation for the upcoming release. Call it version 5 of the product's documentation. And the dot you see here is a little bit lower on the line because the changes in that branch are more recent as I'm working. And you're going to see more and more green dots on this line as time goes by. They don't necessarily represent all of the version 5 documentation. Each dot is more likely to represent a merging of commits from a particular branch, feature branch, because you get done with some documentation before other documentation. And it's like I said before, there might be 10 features that you think might be part of the next release, but over time it becomes clear that only 7 things are going to get into that release. So by merging these feature branches in one at a time into the release branch as they get finished, you got better control over what's happening. So in addition to the master and release branches, I'll typically have several feature branches. How many? Well, that depends on what's going on with our developers and with our different products. I might have 10, 20, 30, maybe more feature branches going on at the same time. And the lines that you see here in this graphic from the release branch, that signifies that I'm creating these new feature branches based on my release branch. So they start out as exact copies of my release branch. Now, as work progresses in each feature branch, you're constantly saving new commits and pushing them up to the remote repository. That's why you see multiple dots on each of these branches as time goes by. You just keep committing changes every day, sometimes multiple times a day. Let's say that I work and work on the feature 1 branch until it's done. There's nothing left to do. Well, at that point, I'll merge my feature 1 branch into my release branch. And then I'm pretty much done with that feature 1 branch. It's served its usefulness, and eventually later on, I'll just delete it altogether. So here is another green dot. And this represents just the stuff from the feature 1 branch. And then later, if I end up merging the feature 2 branch into release, I'll get another green dot for that. So question, what happens if the developer for feature 1 says, yeah, I actually don't think I'm going to get the feature done in time. It's just going to have to wait for a later release. Doesn't that mess me up if I've already merged that stuff into the release branch? Well, yes, it can. However, like I mentioned before, our developers are using the same Git Flow process that I'm using. So I have a rule. I established a rule that I will never, ever merge the changes from one of my feature branches to release until the developer also merges his changes from his feature branch to his release branch. Doing that gives me a whole lot more certainty that the feature is going to end up in the final release, because the developer is not going to want to back out his changes anymore than I want to back mine out. Plus, we have QA and a whole bunch of other people involved. So there's really a high degree of certainty when our developers move something into the release branch. And not only that, because I kept my changes for that feature in a separate branch, I can more easily back those changes out of the release branch if it does come to that, but it usually doesn't. Okay, so now, once I merge changes from a feature branch into my release branch, I need to make sure I also merge changes from my release branch into my ongoing feature branches, the ones that aren't done yet. That keeps everything up to date. So over time, I'm going to merge changes from a bunch of other feature branches into the release branch. For example, I could merge feature 2 into the release branch like you see here. And so there's another green dot to represent that. And then if I merge feature 3 into the release branch like you see here, you get another green dot for that. And when the day comes that we release our product and I publish the final output, I merge from the release branch into the master branch. So now I have another blue dot to represent that. And that is the whole cycle for a product. And then it starts all over again for that product. I continue working on stuff for the next product release. And at the same time as all of this, there are additional cycles and all kinds of other branches that are going on for other products that we have. Each product is going through its own cycles. So because all of our MadCap product documentation is coming from the same Flare project, I'm going to end up with more blue dots on that line for the master branch. And each one of those blue dots can represent the final output for a specific version of a particular product. Hopefully this is all making sense as I'm talking it through. Now let's talk a little bit about tools and steps. You do have options for different tools to use for source control tasks, the day-to-day things that you do. Of course, you can use the Flare interface. Or you can use something like Visual Studio. I happen to use Visual Studio for most things. And the only reason I'm doing that is habit. I've just been using Visual Studio for so long and I'm used to that interface and I use it for other things. So it's already open. And so that's what I use a lot of the time for source control. But I could just as easily use the Flare interface or something else. Sometimes I do use the Flare interface for something if I don't have Visual Studio open. But they both do the same stuff, so it really doesn't matter. Again, the beauty of Flare is that it's flexible and you have options and you can use what you want. Or you might decide to use a command line tool like Git Bash. That's what I use for certain advanced things that I can't do otherwise. I'll talk about that in a minute. This isn't an exhaustive list, by the way. This isn't every possible tool. I'm just listing a few things to show you that you have options. And there's not time, like I said, in this webinar to go into all of the step-by-step details of specific Git tasks. But still, I do want to give you just a little taste. I want to, just so you get the idea. So right now, I'm going to show you how to complete the same task in these 3 different tools. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a single commit for the current changes in a Flare project and push them up to a remote repository. So I've been working in my Flare project. got some changes, need to commit them, push them. So here is what it might look like in Flare. So in Flare, you got this pending changes window pane that you can open and keep open. And it will populate automatically as you're working in your project, and you make changes to files like you see here, or you add a new file and they'll just load this window pane up. And so that indicates that, hey, you got changes, you got to commit these things. So you could commit them, files in separately. But if I want to just take this whole group and commit them all in one, I can do that. And I've got my source control ribbon open up here. So I can just go and click commit all. And then it opens up this dialog. And in this dialog, it loads these 3 files. And again, I can click the checkboxes if I want to leave something out of the commit. But I'm just going to include all of these. So then I add my comment in here. Again, you can get as specific as you feel you need to. And I click commit. And then, actually, I messed up. And let me go back. Because these are animated GIFs going through here. So pushing the changes up to the remote. And as soon as that happens, as soon as it finishes, then this pending changes window pane will clear out. And so you know that, okay, you've finished, and you push it up. So that's how it happens. You commit them all, add your comment, and then click that push button. Just going to let it run through here again since I messed up before and went on to the next screen. So I'm just adding my comment, commit all, clears out that pending changes, click push, and then I just click that other button and I push them up to the remote and it goes through, should finish okay. So that's what it looks like in Flare. Now this is Visual Studio and same stuff, just a different interface. You can see I've got this Team Explorer view, and this is a list of branches that I've created, and I've got my widget editor branch checked out. You can see here and here. And the thing about Visual Studio, what it does is it shows you these numbers down at the bottom, and that's your indicator that, hey, you've made changes in this branch. You got to commit them. So you can see I've got the number 3 here on the right. So if I want to commit those, I can go down and click that button, and it opens up this other view. And so now this is similar to what you saw in Flare with the pending changes window pane. There's the 3 files, and there's my area to add a comment. So I do that, and I say commit all in here, and it will commit them. Now, once it does that, notice what happened down here. The number 3 changes to 0 because I took care of things. I committed those 3 files, and then this number changed from 0 to 1, which means, hey, the Visual Studio is saying, hey, you got a commit that you made, but you still got to push it up. You're not done yet. And so you go and you click on that, and you click push, and it should just finish here, okay. And it does. Okay, so that's what it looks like in Visual Studios. Exact same stuff, slightly different UI. Now, here's Git Bash. And Git Bash is a command line tool, so you have to know something about some of the about commands if you're going to do this stuff. I've already entered one command in here where I navigated to my project. So you got to get to that location. And then I'll add this other commit in, or this other command in here where I'm actually I'm gathering up. I said git add a -a, and so I'm saying, hey, just gather up all of my current changes and put them in this staging area. And then I will add this other command in here. Now I'm doing my actual commit. And I put the comment in quotation marks in here, and then press enter, and then you should see a bunch of stuff below that, and it finished okay. Okay, so now I've done my commit. Now I just need to finish and do the push. So that's real simple, just to get push, and a whole bunch of other stuff will show, and it'll give you an error if things don't go well. But it finished okay. So that's what it's like in a command line tool like Git Bash. Now, if you are going to use a command line prompt like Git Bash, you will have to become familiar with what the main Git commands are. And then there are additional details you often have to include with the basic command. You saw that in the animated GIF that we just looked at. Sometimes you just have to look things up on the internet. That's what I do. And but I documented the main stuff that I have to do repeatedly. I documented that in the PDF that I'm going to share with you in a bit. For example, so why would I use Git Bash when I could use Visual Studio or Flare? Well, I just know that if I add a whole bunch of new images to my Flare project, there's a good chance that Visual Studio isn't going to be able to handle that. For some reason, it's just not good at it. Too many images, and it just can't complete it. It lets me commit, but it won't let me push. So it gives me this kind of cryptic message. And I just know from experience, when I see that, I know when that happens, I need to open Git Bash and do the push. So that's what I do. So you can keep your own list of the main Git commands handy, like you see here. You could go on the internet and buy a coffee mug like this one. It has popular Git commands on it. This is a real thing, by the way. So go Google Git coffee mug, you'll see it. You can also document your own steps that you find yourself using most, like I did for myself in that PDF that I'm going to share with you. I will say that at first it can be a little intimidating if you're not used to it to use a command line tool, but like anything else, you just get used to it over time. By the way, you don't have to be any kind of a Git expert to do this. I'm certainly not a Git expert. Really, I just know enough to get my job done, and I learn more about Git over time as I need to. Before we wrap this up and go to some questions, let's go over a few tips that I've found helpful over the years. First, use caution when you're renaming, moving, and deleting files, especially when you're doing that with a lot of files. These kinds of actions, rename, move, delete, they're notorious for causing issues in source control. I'm not saying don't do these things. Everybody has to rename, move, delete files from time to time. I'm just saying be careful, especially since you often have to update links to other files in Flare when renaming or moving something. So it's a whole bunch of files that can be affected by just renaming one or a few files. So have a plan to minimize the issues. Communicate with your coworkers if you think it might be an issue so that nobody's taken by surprise. If you ask other people on your team to do a pull or a merge, after you do things like this, you might be able to avoid issues or catch problems more quickly rather than down the road. You might consider making these kinds of changes in smaller chunks instead of trying to move or rename tons of folders or files all at once, and then commit and push each small group of files that you change. You might even try to do reorganization stuff like this in off hours when other authors aren't working so that you're not getting tangled. Second, perform source control tasks frequently. I don't mean that you have to commit changes every 5 minutes, but when you have multiple people working on the same project, conflicts are going to happen from time to time. By that, I mean that two authors will make changes to the same place in the same file. And then when the last person tries to push their commits, the tool goes, well, this other person made changes too. Do you want to keep your changes? Do you want to keep their changes? Do you want to keep some of both? What do you want to do? Sometimes when that happens, you can get through the conflict okay. You can see what's happening in there. but other times you're not sure what to do. And the more time that passes, the harder it is to remember what changes you made or the other person made. You say to the other author, hey, what were those changes you made in that one file? Well, if you wait weeks to commit or push changes or merge branches, people will go, I don't know, that was a long time ago, I can't remember. And then it's just harder to sort it all out. So one of the ways that I've dealt with this is that I documented daily activities that everyone on the team should do. So there are all kinds of steps for all kinds of source control things that we need to do. Some of these are tasks that you don't have to do that often. They're rare. Maybe once every few weeks or even months or a year. You just don't do them that often. But I found that there are certain things that each author should do every single day. Mainly I'm talking about doing pulls and pushes and merges for certain branches on a regular basis. And I found that if each author does those things consistently, they become habits, and it helps reduce the chance of conflicts and issues. Next, if you're on a team, you might consider assigning different files or sections to different authors. Doing that might not get rid of file conflicts altogether. Conflicts and issues, they're just going to happen sometimes, but it might help reduce them. Sometimes authors are simply going to need access to the same files, like snippets, so you might not be able to divide everything up. But for certain files, say for example, targets and style sheets, it might be a good idea to have only one person or a couple of people at most making changes to those kinds of files, because they can be harder to deal with conflicts than, say, topic files. Now, what about tables of contents? Well, they're not topics, so it's not HTML, but it's common for all authors to need to edit those. Now, if you have a team and you get a conflict where two authors made changes to the same place in a TOC file, you could just resolve those differences in the merge editor that comes up, maybe combining changes from both authors. But you kind of need to be comfortable with editing a file like that in the merge editor, because it's not standard HTML like topics where people are familiar with that. These are custom Flare tags that are used for the TOC files. So you need to understand those tags a little bit so that you don't make invalid changes. But that's what I usually do when we have conflicts in a TOC file. I just resolve things in the merge editor. And here is what that could look like. This happens to be from Visual Studio, but it looks similar in Flare and in other tools, where there's a TOC, and this shows the changes on the left from one person, and this person added a TOC entry, and that goes to a what's new file. And the second author was making changes to the same TOC file, and at the same place, they tried to create an entry to key features. And so the system doesn't know what to do. And so it gives you a conflict, and you open that conflict, and then you open up this merge tool to see what's going on. And you have to make a decision here. Do you want their change? Do you want your change? And or you could combine them. And the final result is going to be down here in the bottom. So I can go and click that, and it will automatically populate this change from the first author and put it down here. And I could finish there, but then it leaves out this other thing. So what you can actually do is, if you're real careful, you can click and select and copy and paste this below the other one. Again, you have to be careful. There, so you paste it, and so it's got both of them. One's going to come first, and then the other one. But yeah, if you aren't careful and don't include a quotation mark or something like that, then you try to open this up in Flare, and it won't let you because it's invalid, and you have to open it up in the text editor. But yeah, you can do that. You can solve the issue that way. Now, for a lot of teams, however, that you might not want to do that. For a lot of teams, it might be easier to work and have multiple TOC files. And then different authors could be in charge of their own TOC, so you don't get conflicts because you're working separately. And then you can have a master TOC where you have links to each of those little TOCs, and they just kind of all get merged together when you generate the output. So this is what it could look like. You can see here, I've got these TOCs over on the left. I've got a master TOC, and I've got three, separate TOCs, and I just kind of want to keep these separate. Maybe 3 different authors working on these 3 TOCs, and then you got the master. And the master is open here, and you can see I've got at the top just a regular entry that links to a topic, introduction, but then these other 2 things are actually linking to these TOCs. And even though these are kind of flat, it's just one word in here, these TOCs have, can have books and sub-books and all kinds of things in them, but you'll see those when you generate the output. So I can go and create a new entry for that last TOC. I'll just name it people like the other one. And then I double click it, and it opens up this, the dialog. And so in here, you can see it's not linked to anything, and I can say, select a TOC instead of linking it to a topic. And then I choose the TOC that I want, click open, click advanced. Now I'm doing this because this is just an extra thing where I'm saying, okay, where I have this link, I want to do something where when these things are merged, I want to replace that node with the first part of the TOC, so that when the end user clicks on that, it's going to open up the very first thing in that linked TOC. So what I do is I click that, select replace, click OK, and I'm done. So you can do it that way, and that will avoid conflicts because you're just everybody's working in different files. And finally, under tips, one thing that I've found to be extremely useful is creating a tag, a custom tag when I merge from my release branch to my master branch. Here's what I mean by that. So when you do commits and merges in source control, you have a history log that you can open that shows all of this stuff happening over time. And when you look at the history, it can be a lot to take in and try to make sense of. You got these dots and arrows over here on the left, and then you see these auto-generated IDs, and then you see who made the commit and when, and then the comment for each commit is on the right. And you can see why comments are important. Otherwise, you'd have no clue what each of these things means. But even with comments, it can be difficult to do things like figure out what was the commit when you finished a cycle for a product and moved things into the master branch. Where's that point in time? Well, I mentioned hot fixes before. This is where you need to go back to make a change, sometimes a small one, to some output that you already finished and published, but time's gone by and your release branch already has new things in it, and you don't want to mess with that. So what you want to do is open the history for your master branch and locate the exact spot where you published certain output. And then you can right-click on that commit and create a new temporary branch just to make that change, that hotfix. But you look at the history and you go, where's that commit? That's not easy to find in here. So what I do is I create these custom tags when I merge from the release branch to the master branch. And when you look at the history, it'll look something like this. It's much easier to find. So these 2 green things are custom tags that you can see the commits, and you can see the commits that they belong to. That way, I can easily see where I had certain publishing milestones. I can see that this one is on the bottom is where we released the last version of Flare, and this one above is where we released the last version of Central. So that can be really useful. So now I can create my hotfix branch based on one of those commits, and I have confidence that it's the correct thing. Now, to create a tag like that, you need to use a command line tool like Git Bash, but it's one of those things that I documented for myself. So when the time comes to do it, it's just a few easy steps and I'm done. So as I promised at the beginning of this webinar, I created that internal MadCap PDF that I want to share with you. And here it is. So you can just put this into your browser URL and it'll open it up. There's a whole bunch of details and steps in here that are specific to how we use source control for the MadCap documentation. Honestly, I just created this thing at first primarily for myself as a reference because I can't remember everything all the time. But it's also useful for new writers on the team because I explain everything in this webinar in there and more stuff to help someone who's new get started. Now, if you decide to look through this PDF, just remember I'm mainly using Visual Studio for most things, so the steps were written specifically for that, but all of the steps in this PDF are exactly the same things that you can do in Flare or another tool. And if you want to use Flare's interface, all of the main Git tasks are already documented in detail in Flare's online help, so you already have that. So you just take those same steps and you follow the interface or commands for whatever tool you're using. I'll just highlight a few places in this PDF that might be of particular interest to you after watching this webinar. So pages 13 and 14 contain some best practices. Some of these are things I talked about in this webinar, some I didn't cover. Pages 26 and 27 contain an overview of those daily tasks that I talked about. So somebody new to the team could just print out these 2 pages, pin them to their wall, and make sure they do them every day until they become a habit. And when they're doing these things automatically by memory, they don't need to keep those printouts anymore. Pages 87 through 85 cover the steps for merging from the release branch to the master branch. And this is where I include the steps on those custom tags that I was just talking about. And then pages 96 through 119, that's where I documented some of the common problems that I would encounter with source control and how to solve them. So it's not like this section covers every conceivable problem you're going to have. It's just that I found myself encountering the same kinds of things over and over again. And I wanted to write them down so that it was always easy to get past them and I could just get on with my work. So that's pretty much it. I ran right up against the time. I'm going to turn it over to Jen here briefly, and we'll see if we have time for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That was fantastic. This was so helpful. I hope everybody agrees and enjoyed this. This is great information. We do have some great questions coming in, and we won't be able to get to them all. I'm so sorry given our time, but please keep them coming because we're going to be answering them all and getting these back out to you. So keep posting them, but we will get to a few. There's a few conceptual ones that I do want to cover that I think will be beneficial for the audience. Now, for anybody who's new to Flare, or if you're looking to grow, or there's a need to add on additional licenses to support your team, there's a fantastic promotion going on right now through the end of the year where you can get 3 months free for new license subscriptions. That's across the board on all of the tools. So, great time to get them now and then have those extra 3 months in case you're ramping people up. You're not losing out on any time there. So definitely get in touch with your sales rep or email sales@madcapsoftware.com. Wonderful way to save a few bucks before year end. And who doesn't want to do that? So the next thing I want to remind everybody about is Mad World next year. It's going to be in Austin, October 3rd through the 6th. If you haven't registered, there's a great discount going on the registration through month end. So pop up to our website just to see our talented panel of speakers and all the great sessions that we're going to be hosting. If you haven't registered, please consider doing so. Save some money. We would love to see you there. It's a lot of fun. All right, Paul, great questions coming in. There's one in particular. Yeah, well, there's one in particular that popped up a couple times. So I thought this would be a good one to start with and great for the audience and kind of a great conceptual question, which is, why not just use conditional markers to document these features? Are we duplicating our content? Why not just use conditional text to keep these features and things separate?
Yeah, and some people do that, and I used to do that long ago, way before I started using branching. I would condition certain things just in case. They didn't make it in there, but it's more. I found it to be a lot more clunky than using branching, and you got to go find those conditions. Sometimes you have to make sure that everybody on your team is applying them correctly. So it's not that you can't do that, but I've done that, and I've done branching, and branching is much more seamless and streamlined, just works better for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Another great question that came up a couple times when you were showing the Flare interface, I think some of our eyes were drawn to the sync button. Can you talk a little bit about what the sync does in relation to pull and commit? Is it a twofer or a threefer, or what's the benefit of the sync button?
Okay, so yeah, that's a great question. I like the sync button. The sync button is sort of a lazy person's button, and so I would use that a lot of times. So you're doing those three things. You're doing a pull, you're doing a commit, and you're doing a push. So if you're just kind of like lazy, like I tend to be, you can click sync, and so then it'll pull. It does these things, and then if you've got things that you need to commit, it'll bring up the dialog and you add your comment, and then you push. And so it's instead of clicking multiple buttons, you can click that one. Right. It's just an option, it's a preference. Yeah.
So click saver.
it's a lazy button.
Okay, that's yeah. Okay. Now another thing too. When you work on multiple release branches at the same time, how do you, is there something that is something, and again, I'm trying to combine a bunch of questions into one that are similar. What does Flare tell you? If you happen to collide, is there something in the Flare interface that pops up to let you know you've got a conflict?
Well, you get conflicts when, like I showed, when you are trying to push a commit and you got another author who made changes. Now, if another author made changes in the same file, but they could easily just kind of be merged. You're not going to get it'll just merge them together easily. But it's only when the system doesn't know what to do, when it's like you're telling me to do this in this place and this same thing in this place, then you're going to get them. But that doesn't really have to do with the branching. That's just simple commits and pushes. So I'm not exactly sure how to answer that with the branches. I haven't had any conflicts to speak of with branches. It's just something that I just sort of organize by naming things, and I know that my history is going to change over time. I'm going to be releasing one product in October, and there's the commit for that, and then a separate product could be in January, and there's one for that. But it's just updated project files, changes happening at that time. But my the older product isn't getting messed up by those new, that new merge that's happening. Yeah, I use conditions throughout my products on folders, and I keep I could show, I wish I had time to show my project where I have conditions per product. And so the outputs, if I'm making changes for one product, it's not messing up the other product because those things are conditioned out automatically. So I'm using conditions to make sure that, products aren't getting the wrong updated content, in each one. I have no idea if I even came close to answering that.
That was helpful. Another question that I'm going to try to combine, because again, I'm seeing a couple of them here that are similar, just to save on time. But how do you find your branches? Is it sort of dependent on the source control platform you choose to use?
Yeah, they all have different interfaces, but it's never been anything that I've had trouble doing. So for example, in Flare, there's a source control explorer, and that came up on one of those slides. And so it just lists all the branches that you have in there. And then in Visual Studio, there's a view where it shows all of your branches, and it shows the local branches, and then you can expand and see the remote branches, the clones of those. So I've never had a problem finding the branches. They're all just kind of grouped together in the UI. I wish I had more time to show that, how to go through and create branches and where they are, where they're located, but it's really not that difficult.
All right. And then another, just to kind of build on that, if you're not using Git, if you're using TFS or Perforce, so again, similar question, can we apply some of these concepts to these other tools?
Yeah, you can, particularly some of these tips at the end that are just sort of best practices that are, communication with coworkers and do things in small chunks, things like that. But, we didn't have, and I don't know what the latest of TFS or DevOps server looks like, but we didn't have really the same way to do branching there. Now I can't speak about Perforce or Subversion. I believe that Perforce has streams, something like that, which is like branches. So you should be able to do the same thing. It's just that this guy, Vincent Dreesen, was trying to explain how you can keep your workflow going smoothly by doing things in a certain order and having these different types of branches. So if one of these other tools is also able to do something similar to what Git does, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to take some of these same things and use them. It's really, it's mostly you and your team just being familiar with what your rules are and when you move things from one place to another. So yeah, I think you should be able to use a lot of this in some of these other tools.
Okay, so just one other final question, because this came up a couple times and I thought this would be good. I think everybody was sort of drawn to that helpful source control tool ribbon that you showed that's just in Flare. How do you see that? Is that something that shows up when you bind your project to the source control platform you choose to use, or how do you get that to show up?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually one of the really nice things about Flare. If you're not bound to source control, it's not going to bother you with that source control ribbon, and you're not even going to see it. It's the moment that you go through the binding process, you bind your project, and you go into project properties, and you select source control and bind, and you put in the information. The second that you click OK and it's all good, then you're going to see that source control ribbon.
Right. And same thing if you're binding to central, if that was your source control repository. I mean, it's done in a little bit different way, but with just a couple clicks, you would see it. Once you choose central as your source control backend, that same Git source control ribbon would show up since it's using Git on the backend.
Exactly.
So same philosophy, same terminology, I guess, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Just so everybody knows that this question came up a lot, and I'll just kind of reassure everybody. Everybody wants that PDF that you shared. We are going to be sending it out to everyone along with the recording. There's going to be a webinar assets link on the page on our website, so you'll have access to these slides and the link to the PDF. We will get it to everybody. And we're also going to take a little time to answer some of these questions together behind the scenes and send it out to everyone too, because they're fantastic. I tried to do my best to get to the common ones just to save time. But yeah, we'll get all of these out. So I want to thank you, Paul. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I'll just say something about the slide deck. Yeah, we'll get it to you, but it'll come in PDF form. But as you saw, I put in some animated GIFs in here because I wanted to show some action, and there's some other animations in places. So you'll get it, but it's a static version of that. So if you want to kind of like relive the thing and see it in action again, you'd want to go back to the recorded webinar and go see it in action. That's
right. Yeah. So yeah, please look for that, everybody, because we will be sending it out. So Paul, thanks so much. We're over time, so thanks everybody for hanging on. We want to be respectful of everybody's scheduled time today. A lot of shout outs to your t-shirt, Paul. I can't help but mention that.
It was just next in the closet.
Yeah.
I think that's the way all tech writers dress, is what's next in the closet.
Yeah. So, and I want to thank the audience too. This has been great. Everybody's been so engaged. Such fantastic questions. Probably have to have you back, Paul, and do more about this. Clearly a popular topic. So I think everybody would agree. So thanks so much, everybody, for joining. We hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. We're thankful that you chose to spend this time with us. It's so great to engage and to hear everybody's questions. So thanks, Paul, once again. Appreciate it as always. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the week. And we hope to see you on the next webinar. So take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.